on. So yeah, I'm Ed. Nice to meet you all. So we've got our work cut out for the first session. We've just got to develop a relational model of dementia within half an hour. So I did say to Peter actually that this is very much what I'm about, sociology, qualitative research. So I've got to fit my entire life's work within a half-hour session, which Peter kindly pointed out, yeah, but your life's achievements, you can cover those very promptly indeed. So anyway, he's on next, so make sure you give him a hard time. This is very much what I do. I'm a researcher. Dementia, ageing is my field. I lecture in, I won't give you too much autobiography for a short session. I lecture in health and social care here. And I'll be drawing upon my own research in this session, and you can draw out some practice-related insights and hope bring to bear your own experience as we progress. So I'll talk at you in for a little bit, but do obviously jump in if I'm going too quickly. And there's a bit of a task we can do for 10 minutes in, and hopefully we'll squeeze it all in. So we're starting just with why we require a relational model. So here's just a well-known text. We can pick this up. Looks very friendly, doesn't it? We're a penguin. So you pop into Watson's Daniel Dennett, very well-established American philosopher. And I'll just read it just to bring it off the slide. So we can cope with the world around us effectively if we are normal. There are unfortunate human beings who, for one reason or another, cannot, and they must live among us in a reduced status, rather like pets at best. Cared for and respected, restrained if necessary, loved and loving in their own limited ways, but not full participants in the human social world. So no reference to dementia there in particular, but nevertheless about, let's say, cognitive deficit. And I'm not sure what you think to that quote, because this is what we'll draw out as we sort of work through the session. We need to be credible about the challenges of dementia, but I think we can probably highlight reduced status. Sounds a little bit problematic to me, probably an understatement. Pets, okay, restraint might be required at times. I'm not dismissing what's happening in a practice environment, but anyone think that's, I suppose, hands up, think that's a reasonable representation? Be bold, or you don't look like you're convinced? Okay, we'll go with that. Say again, sir?
Oh no,
you agree? It's problematic.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the endorsement. But I think, and again, I'm not trying to dismiss the fact we need to be credible. And I say we'll pick that up as we work through. But again, I look through this and this isn't marginal. This is a text in, like I say, freely a penguin text. But it represents as well, when we go, I suppose I'm trying to highlight the kind of, what we could almost call a kind of standard societal view of dementia perhaps, before people have thought about it in a critical sense. You'll still see it now in mainstream press as well. I could pick out articles from Matthew Paris in the Times, for example, wrote something about euthanasia, which problematic, let's say. And you'll see other texts where it's, again, some of the terminology, well, let's pick out the obvious ones, burden, suffering. You need to be credible. We're not perhaps dismissing these things, but we align it to intrinsically with the experience of dementia. Empty shell, that's a term that gets used even in academic literature. So dehumanising, let's go as far as saying that. And again, that's not just coming up in, gutter press, that's featuring in academic text. So just that's the platform. This is probably where very distillation perhaps of the challenges that we're confronted with when devising a relational model. So let's say the architect of the sort of relational model, and this is the resistance to this very negative societal perspective, is Tom Kitwood. That's chief architect, let's say. So this key term, personhood, which is about the relational basis of experience. So we're not reducing it to neurodegeneration. We're not just the brain and its function and loss of function in dementia. We need to think about the person, and especially personhood relates in practical terms to person-centred care, and this is what Kitwood is addressing. Again, just to bring it off the page again, so it's a standing or status that is bestowed upon one human being by others in the context of relationship and social being. It implies recognition, respect and trust. So straight away we're into more positive language, as we may notice moving on from Dennett. We may notice certain things we could pick up as well, sort of the status bestowed, so it's granted by other people. I suppose we may query that as we move through the session. But it's to recognise, we're people, and I suppose what makes us people to a large extent is our relationships, isn't it? We're very much defined by our relationships with others. We don't have a self-concept unless it's divided in relation with other people. So we need to think about these relational, these social conditions. So does that give us just a platform to move on? We start off with the very negative societal definition. We've got Kitwood from sort of psychological perspective, trying to have this sense of personhood thinking about relational conditions, not just the brain and neurodegeneration, but also trying to generate a more positive sense of the experience of dementia. It's not just brain disease, there's a good link to the living well with dementia strategy as well now. Another term, just to build up, I'm not going to bombard you with too many terms, but this sort of follows on from Kitwood to say almost we didn't go far enough. We need to be thinking, so couplehood, so we're really elevating the relationship to the centre of our model. So we're seeking to embed that relational basis further. The challenge, I suppose, is if you're not in a spousal relationship, how much does this concept apply? But nevertheless, it shows the progression of what we're doing in relational terms. So yeah, taking it further, and again, that sort of sense of the positive nature of relationships. This is some of the terminology associated with the couplehood concept, just picked from their papers. They're doing things together. We are a team, and an us identity. So moving just beyond thinking in individualistic terms, and also living positively. So we're getting a sense again, relationships and a more positive discourse around the experience of dementia. I suppose it relates back to Kit would sometimes critique for still not being relational enough. That sort of subtitle to his book, The Person Comes First. We need to be even thinking in more relational terms than Kit would. So we'll just be drawing a bit on my research as we progress, just to kind of bring it off the page again a bit more, just to actually look at what people with dementia and their partners are saying. So sadly we haven't got enough time to do a qualitative research session. So just very briefly, I am doing another study at the moment where I invert that gender relationship, but what we'll be looking at, just the data today, is 14 couples I interviewed, where it's the man with dementia in particular. So mostly there was one same-sex couple, but otherwise it was female carers. And so I'm interviewing him in their own home, interviews hour and a half, pretty flexible, open-ended approach that I'm adopting. Like I say, really my thing, qualitative research, we'd love to go on about it for ages, but sadly time constraints and you don't get to listen to that this evening, I'm afraid. Sorry to disappoint you. But in its broadest terms, I'm focusing on relationships and care. So the relationship between the couple, relationship with family members, and also thinking about the professional support that they were accessing. So that just gives you a little bit of a framework that the data that we'll be looking at and drawing upon. So here's one of the quotes. This is from one of the men with dementia in my study, just to try to draw out some of the challenges of having dementia, what we're addressing. So again, the names have been changed in line with ethical research practice. So this is what Timothy is stating. So you have to be careful, because I was telling everyone that I had dementia, then they automatically thought that he's got dementia. And so then I decided to go to the gym, because when people know I go to the gym, they've got more idea as to what the situation is. I could go out and say, oh, well, I've joined the gym now. It was a means of conversation, not just saying, by the way, do you know that I'm a nutter? So just a neat little quote there, which just, again, we're getting the direct perspective of the person with dementia, but it's about not being, again, so there's a little bit of perhaps confused speech in there, but not, I think we're certainly getting the gist of what Timothy's stating, aren't we? So it's about the status of not being reduced to the dementia. I'm actually a gym attender as well. We have these sort of typologies of the self as well. So we are biological being, we have relational being and social being as well. And so there's just a neat example there of Timothy not being defined by the condition. Like I say, I'm a gym attender, and I can tell people I attend the gym now. And again, we can query to the extent of what it's a male strategy there, but that sort of self-deprecating humour at the end there. Actually, so. I'm not just a nutter, but in a sense they're kind of co-opting and preempting any judgment as well there. So, using that self-deprecating humour to beat people to the punch. So just to summarise, before we sort of move on to seeing the sort of what the carers say, the female carers. But again, that's just one example of a quote. So there's, I could pick out many more quotes which kind of elaborate on these things, but I think we still see some of this coming through. That association with the need to be active still, not to sort of be defined by the dementia, not to be passive, being positioned in a passive and vulnerable way. Again, like I say, I could present with many quotes that draw out these facets, but these societal standards around being self-sufficient, autonomous, being in control, that place a challenge on the person with dementia. And we can query as well if they present a particular challenge to men with dementia. We need to avoid an essentialist account where we claim it's entirely different experience for men and women, but sex shapes experience, doesn't it, really, whether we're biological determinists or whether we think it's, or cultural determinists we accept. So it's a tricky line to sort of to navigate. We need to avoid, like I say, that essentialist account. Let's not deny that gender has palpable impacts on experience. And there is this tendency as well for the men to present a sense that either a stoicism or I'm actually fighting back against the condition. I'm like, for one of the men, I'm now taking Aricept. I'm now back to my pre-diagnostic state. So there's a sense of continuity carrying on as normal in inverted commas. And also we judge people very negatively, don't we, in society? Dependency. It's about being independent, self-sufficient. Again, actually more from a carer who was very concerned with being positioned as a scrounger as a consequence. Younger person, younger carer, not able to work anymore because of their care responsibility, in a real sense that they're being positioned. And that just distills, it came through in many different ways, but that just highlights that sense about that, the challenges of being positioned as dependent. So we're moving on now. That's for the man with dementia. So like I said, I was interviewing both men with dementia and their carers as well. So here's just a quote from one of the carers. So, because I've told the girls, the daughter, they must put him into care, and me. They must put us into care, you know, do what you like, but don't burden yourselves. I'd rather take an overdose, and that's the God's honest truth. I'd do myself in if I thought I was a burden. My philosophy of life is that when you get to 70, you should have a needle. You've had your 60 years and 10, let the young uns carry on. I think it's your 70th birthday, and you can have a little party, and here's your tablets. So, extreme. To say the least, for promoting senicide or geronticide, that we get the 60 and 10 and everyone should be put down essentially. But here showing very palpably the challenges of caring for a person with dementia, but again that sense of being positioned as, my interpretation here is in line with the rest of my data, is it's almost a case of co-opting any sense that we are a drain on resources or could be a burden. Actually I'm going to take it the next step further, you know, I think we should all be put down at the age of 70. One of the more extreme expressions within my study, but nevertheless this came through, probably the most vivid part of my study was the moral challenge of caring. The fact the need to be seen to be a good carer, to be a self-sufficient carer, not to be allowing the care responsibilities to be dispersed onto others. So just to summarise that point. And often the frustration of caring would come out, the frustration of dealing with the partner. But then, being a good carer, you feel frustration, you feel guilt then for feeling frustration. You also that it's a recursive challenge, psychological challenge of caring. Oh, you know, you keep repeating and keep losing things, but then I feel bad, and you know, and so real challenges there. We have that impact on the loss of independence. Some people would be in my study. Obviously, we need to highlight how much it varies the experience of dementia and caring as well, depending on the nature of the condition, at which point the condition is. But for some people, we'll talk about needing to care 24/7, so if depending on the nature of the condition and its position. There's that key design. This comes from that previous quote, that design not to, again, burden, probably in inverted commas there, but family members, not allowing younger family members to take up the care responsibilities, shielding people from the care responsibilities, but also not allowing society or the state to pick them up. There's a sense, again, of not wanting to be seen as dependent. And we have that living well with dementia strategy, and I suppose the query is that I've drawn out is living well with dementia? Okay, it's a laudable aim. How credible is that for anybody, but how for people who care for people with dementia? So that's what I was addressing in that paper. So as we've worked through there, we've got a sense of treating the societal standards of what dementia is, we've got cultural pressures, we've got then how it impacts upon men, that desire for sort of continuity, to be seen as carrying on as normal. We've then just seen an example from the carer, again, many quotes that would give you different dimensions and angles on this, but the sense of needing to give an account of, they need to almost give a candid and credible account of the challenges they're experiencing. So that's where we're at, and so it's over to you now to just see how these come together. So there's just some data then. This is data from this same study, and what we're now looking at is, so I'll let you have a look at these. I don't know what time we're on. What time are we on, Colin?
We're on between 25 past and 6:30.
Okay, so we had 5 minutes looking at these, and bit of feedback. So if I just if you just take one and pass one around, and I'll be the pilot or an astronaut. So apologies, we won't go on the green blue debacle. We'll work round, shall we then? So if we'll start off with the red team. So it's really just, don't be constrained by it, it's really what your response is to what's taking place here. All I would just preface, of course, is, and this is actually the challenge of qualitative research as well, is we start off with research interaction where I'm meeting people and chatting for an hour and a half. We then get to the audio, which is, we're removing the body language, we've just got the audio. We get to the transcript, we've lost obviously the inflections and speech. We get to the point of an article, we package things up. So I recognise, of course, that what you're presented with here is a very much a small snapshot, but nevertheless, that's what you've got. So let's see what you have to say. So yeah, it's over to you. What's your response to the quote?
Come on, you started first, but you said about it.
It was good what you said, actually, yeah. It was like almost like turning the relationship into like a parent-child relationship.
Yeah.
Like removing like the disposal.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really good insight. That comes through quite. And actually, that raises just another ethical challenge. Often, the term care is a bit contested, but we'll use that term for now. Often, will position themselves as parents. They'll position the people with dementia as they'll use terminology, and it hasn't come up so much in my current study, which is about women with dementia. And that, from a perspective of the carer, I mean, there's positive discourses around motherhood, for example, being a good carer. So often it will be stated, but then of course we have that, and sometimes often the men with dementia, they will resist that. I mean, sometimes being positioned as clingy or needy, and it will generate that kind of response. So an ethical challenge straight away around the positioning of people.
It might be linked to like her frustration, what pressure is on her,
Yeah.
things like that as well. So you can't really judge it on, she's treating you like a child.
Yeah.
Because you don't know.
I think that's...
So she's almost trying to evidence that this is how difficult my daily life is.
Yeah. Yes, wanting to kind of actually show me as a researcher, actually, actually this was a snapshot. The rest of the interview wasn't like this, really. It was one of those moments where I just thought, I want to. But I think that's the really good point that you both made there, really, as well, about that. Judging without being judgmental or something. I always try to grapple with this myself as a researcher. We need to convey things candidly. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And would we go as far as say, though, the person with dementia is being undermined here to some extent? Yeah, I think we have, again, real challenge for dementia research, practice as well, I'm sure. Other people have far better insights in that to I, but again, we have to be credible. Perhaps the person's being undermined here, but we have to also recognise the frustrations that the carer will be, and about how that then would be conveyed in research terms, and how you would support that. Again, that's beyond my realm of expertise. Yeah. So, anything else to comment on red team? Should get you lots of stickers or something, shouldn't I? But they were lovely insights. But anything else to comment? Is it a little bit uncomfortable to read, do you find, or?
I think the other conversations we had was around testing. What days it kind of proves, and I think that is tiring for both, for the gentleman as well as the wife. I suppose in one aspect. Communication. Whether that was always the case, or whether it's just the case in relation to the fact that he's now got the dementia. But every question, it's like prove you know what day it is, prove what you know what day of the week is. Yeah.
It goes on a bit, doesn't it? That's the thing, I suppose. And to avoid that judgment, but it's here, but it's about that need to almost convey. I'm feeling this frustration. Unless I'm able to convey candidly why I am, then why am I feeling it? So this is otherwise. So there's something about that, and almost a catharsis to it as well. But of course, that then positions the person with dementia as problematic, and we've seen again the men with dementia want to perhaps be seen as competent, to be seen as the condition as they're carrying on as normal, and here I am being positioned in front of somebody else as somebody defective. So I think it is, But I think you've drawn out those points very nicely there. So thank you. Anything else for just the other groups on there? I know you were allocated others, but anything else just you picked up or? Happy with that? Good. Red team have done a good job. Thank you.
Just want to say regarding the implications for policy and practice.
Yeah, please pick that up. Yeah.
The only thing that we kind of mentioned was that we are as social workers episodic. So snapshot, we go in, we go out. With dementia, you really need to have the expertise of everybody that's involved in that person, because it's unable, and we don't know who that person was beforehand and how the dementia has affected that individual.
Yeah.
So it's really important regarding good practice and consistency is that when we go out and do the face assessments, that it's collected.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. Good insight. That's also just in snapshot terms, very much research as well. You have to be circumspect when we're coming to our conclusions, not overreaching in terms of the insights I have. I'm meeting people twice. I think you get some good research insights, but of course it's not the totality of their experience at all. It's just it is very much a snapshot, inevitably. So, yes, thank you for that, Redson. So we won't even query what the colour is, but these two tables here, I believe, were allocated the next quote. So we've got Claire and Philip here. So these two tables here. So feel free to.
We kind of straight away thought in terms of what Claire was the choice of where they went to go for their break. And it's kind of put them in that situation where they felt that was an ideal place to go because of the acceptance. They didn't have to explain themselves, like explaining why they're probably doing things out of the normal as other people do it. So that's kind of restrict the area where they can actually go for holidays and something of that sort, which in fact is kind of probably the wider society or people without the diagnosis might have different options and wider options to choose from. So we just go back to that stereotype again.
Right, yes. So we're just so we're basing on a deficit sort of model of what can't be done. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What's Philip's response to Claire's perspective?
I think he's with us too. I think he's not that bothered about it.
Yeah.
He'll do it in his own bloody way, so he doesn't really care.
It's quite a nice assertion, isn't it?
Yeah. He hasn't allowed it, he doesn't come across that he's allowed it to bother him, but he comes very much across it bothers her.
She feels the need to keep explaining it to people.
She doesn't want to be affiliated with that, doesn't he?
I think it's obviously, you can't always tell by looking at somebody that they've instantly got dementia. It's almost like people feel the need to explain the behaviour and say, oh, it's all right, we've got a reason, I need to explain.
Yeah. Can we empathise with their perspective or sympathise even with it, do you think, though? The fact it's nice to be somewhere where I don't have to explain, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Very much so. I think supported carers, one of the main things for carers is that actually they've got some support for themselves. It's that feeling of feeling comfortable, knowing that she's getting as much of a break as that her husband is, but she's actually getting, she knows that there's people that might have some understanding and can empathise, but actually support her at the same time.
And likewise, then, though, do we see how Philip might feel positioned in a way that I'm the problem here a bit? You know, like, so we can't go somewhere else, and my wife now feels a pressure. So it's all very explicable, isn't it? Really, we see where that's we see where Claire's coming from, don't we? But we also see why Philip would then have his response about, almost sod the societal judgments. I'll do it my bloody way. So.
And is it him again? That male hours expression is that really I'm still myself.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just going back to that sort of points I drew out about the men with dementia that sort of need to be challenged for competence, social competence. That's why I'm eschewing the societal standards. And again, I could have found many quotes which maybe the next team might locate some further examples of this as well. But there is that again, and like I said, we can see again. What we're not seeing, of course, is the nature of the interaction. This is I would have termed it, again, a judgment really, but a good-natured exchange. I could have presented an exchange to you actually, which probably a bit more like the Caroline Nicholas, which was actually where the discord is pretty entrenched, and it's an uncomfortable read, and it was uncomfortable really to be probably a situation where I was talking to my mentor about the nature of the interview that I undertook. But disagreement, that's a feature of relationships, whether we've got whether the person's got dementia or not, isn't it? And actually sometimes it can be some people suppressing things in interviews. That's a challenge of the joint interview process as well. There's another example I could have had where...
My background's in the humanities. In philosophy of religions was really where I started my stuff. So I got into dementia thinking around how philosophy and religious commitments and cultural backgrounds and the way we view the world actually frames the way we understand dementia. And I thought, well, what should we talk about tonight? I thought, well, in a sense, they're neither the wrong way round, because it seems to me the other thing that social workers end up doing a lot of is being involved in the process of diagnosing or at least flagging up if somebody appears to be presenting with dementia. So I thought it's worth having a look at that whole diagnostic process and how it might be affecting different communities in different ways. Now, the background for this is the Prime Minister's Challenge on Dementia, which came out in 2012 and set out a programme for, well, the second iteration of the programme for 2020. Now, actually, we had just agreed a perfectly good national strategy on dementia, which the good David Cameron drove his Rolls Royce right through and he started producing all this sort of stuff. But having said that, the Prime Minister's Challenge on Dementia has served us quite well in a number of ways, and it's been through 2 iterations now, and one of the good things about it is that, unlike some other public policy, it has been regularly evaluated. You can go on the website and you can see regular updates as to what progress is being made. But I think it's interesting that the 2 iterations of it portray dementia in quite distinct ways. So, if you look at the pictures here, they're all pictures of individuals with dementia, or we're led to assume individuals with dementia at any rate, being individual or in a collective context. And the emphasis of that first iteration was on the individual with dementia and what we're going to do about it. And actually, if you look at the second iteration, the emphasis there is much more, as shown in the picture, about people interacting with people with dementia. A person with dementia enjoying some time with somebody who hasn't. And the emphasis of the second iteration of the Prime Minister's Challenge is much more about what do people with dementia actually want. Well, what they want is to be integrated into their communities. They want to be part of what's going on. They don't necessarily want better services. They want a more integrated relationship in there. So that's quite an interesting sort of development from my point of view. But the Prime Minister's Challenge, when it first came out, one of its big sort of emphases was early diagnosis of dementia. And you can see where that was coming from. I mean, lots of clinicians say, for us the nightmare scenario is that the first we know about somebody's dementia is when they come in to accident and emergency confused with a broken arm or having burnt themselves on the stove or something like that. Because then, by then it's already too late. They're already confused. They've already, by definition, lost control of their lives, as it were. And you don't get back easily from there. So there's a lot of emphasis on early diagnosis. How quickly can we get the diagnosis out? And in the last 5 or 6 years, I think it'd be fair to say, there's been a bit of a backlash against that. Because it turns out that early diagnosis is not always the best answer. So, on the plus side, what have you got? Well, the great thing about early diagnosis is that if you diagnose somebody with dementia when they've still got a lot of capacity, then they can make a lot of decisions about what they want to happen next. So they can make decisions about how to dispose of their money, who's going to look after them, and they can make decisions about what sort of environment they want to be in. They can get the normal sort of share lifts in or social care agencies in or something like that. So in that sense, you get further away from that nightmare scenario if somebody just turns up with a broken arm and it turns out they've had dementia. And it's in that context that you can talk, as Ed was talking, about couples doing things, about them making decisions together, which you can't obviously do if you're later in the process. But there are some downsides as well. So people who have had a diagnosis of dementia in its fairly early stages say, this is a really stressful process. You're sort of just about managing, and then somebody comes along and says, you know what, you could have a chronic terminal illness here, and there's no way back from that. And a number of people would say, you know what, I didn't need to know this now, because it's not as if you can do anything about it. I would much have preferred to have gone on for a couple more years with me and my partner sort of muddling along and, oh, look at me, I'm being more forgetful every day. What am I like, you know? And going on like that for a few more years before somebody came along and hit me with the D word and terrified me. So, and of course that's not just for the individual, but it's for the people around them. You know, if I turned up tomorrow and said, I've just been diagnosed with dementia, then there would be a sort of employment management process that would immediately kick in, wouldn't there? And also, you know, my driving licence might go, my insurance would be affected, all my insurances, different sorts of insurance, would all be affected by that. You know, do you actually want that going on? Would I want my wife to think now, oh, this is it, we're just on a downward slide now? So the question was sort of bounced back, saying, actually, you know, when is the appropriate time for people to know? When would you like to know? A lot of people would answer that by saying, well, not yet. Another thing about early diagnosis is that it's not as brilliant as you think. So, with diagnosis of dementia, there's always a problem with differentiating it from some other things. Urinary tract infections, other things that cause some form of delirium, but also chronic mild depression gives very similar symptoms in a lot of cases. If somebody is displaced, if they're feeling old, if they're feeling unloved, all of these things can give dementia-like symptoms. Acute stresses can give dementia-like symptoms. You know, people will tell you, oh, my mum actually, my own mum is a good case in point. My mum seemed fine until she broke her ankle and had to be taken off to hospital and spent 3 days in hospital having it pinned, and she never got back from that experience. And part of that is just, in a crisis, people exhibit dementia-like symptoms. Actually, all of us do. So there's a problem with differential diagnosis. There's a problem with culturally appropriate diagnosis. So this is a picture here of mini mental state exam, which is not used to give a complete picture, but it's often used by GPs, for example, as here's a quickie, let's see if there's something we need to investigate here. And it asks things like, give you a picture, give you a pencil, give you a watch, say, give me the names of these things. Asking, so what's the year? What date is it today? What month is it? Which seem like obvious orientating questions, don't they? If you can't find the names for common things. But actually, you know, if you didn't grow up with pencils and watches around, if you didn't grow up using a Western calendar in English, for example, then there's a real question about, you know, it's obviously going to be much harder work identifying those things. And there is a question about, there's quite a lot of research actually has been done about whether when people from immigrant communities actually do get to diagnostic services to be diagnosed with dementia, whether they're actually overdiagnosed at that point. Now up to that point they're typically underdiagnosed, and I'll come to that, but at that point are they getting overdiagnosed? And a couple of my colleagues here in previous years have been working on that. And then the third difficulty with it is that actually, you know, we're told, yeah, Alzheimer's disease, very distinctive, holes in the brain, vacuolation, you can see them on a CT scan. And we're told it's very simple like that. Actually, it's not. You know, in abundant cases, in a large proportion of cases where Alzheimer's is finally diagnosed, there is little or no vacuolation. In a number of other cases, you get substantial vacuolation without apparently affecting brain performance. So the tools that we have for making diagnosis aren't exactly solid either. So there are problems with the way we diagnose. So that's at the individual level, about what's going on in that diagnostic process. The next level I want to talk about is what's going on in the immediate sort of social context in which that's happening. So, first question, and you might be able to answer this yourself. I'm not going to ask you to discuss it right now, but yeah, what would you see that would make you think, oh, that could be dementia? If you're with a client, or perhaps in a family context, or in your own family, what is it that you spot that says, oh, that's unusual? That could be a sign of something going on.
Repetition.
Sorry?
Repetition.
Repetition. Yeah, so short-term memory, sort of can't remember. Yeah.
Not always, but self-neglect.
Yeah, self-neglect might be in there. Yeah. Yes. Obviously leaving things in places, getting lost in places, those are the sorts of things that we might identify. But there are also things that, at what point does that become dementia? When my partner asks me for the third time, did you say you wanted a cup of tea or not? Yeah, is that dementia? Well, I really hope it's not. I think she's just got her mind on something else, and that's almost certainly what's going on. So what triggers that thing in us that says we need to look into this a bit further?
When they're presenting with a behaviour which it's not their normal presentation, for example.
If assuming that you know what their normal presentation is.
Out of character, yes.
Yeah. I mean, this is a question I keep coming back to, and I have to sort of confess here. My own mum suffered from dementia. She got it relatively early on. By the age of about 67, she was starting to talk. She was saying, "I'm just getting more and more forgetful. I can't remember basic things now." And this was in the late 90s, when dementia wasn't really such a big thing. It wasn't talked about so much. And for years, we said, "Oh, stop being stupid, Mum. There's nothing wrong with you. You've always been forgetful." "Yeah, well, of course you are. I mean, you're moving house. Of course you don't know where anything is," and things like that. And we did that for years. And I wonder now. I don't think it would have affected her experience very much, but I wonder if it would have affected my dad's experience of caring for her till she died. If we had actually been able and willing to go there. But of course, that's a very, very common experience in families. The denial that goes on. There's a study done this was actually of religious ministers in the USA. It's quite a large study about how they handled people with dementia. And what they said, and actually we did some research which bore it out in this country as well, was, we don't have a problem with dementia. We have a problem with the families of people with dementia. Because they can be really hostile, they can be really violent to us, and very rejecting, because you're bringing a piece of news that's going to destroy the family structure. So there's a huge sort of burden on the diagnostic process, not just for the individual, but for what it does to everybody around them. And so all of these complex things. And it's interesting that between the first iteration of the Prime Minister's Challenge, as I said, all about diagnosis. In the second, they said what we really want to focus on now is post-diagnostic support. When somebody's, the neurologist comes in and says, "Oh, hello, Mrs. Kevin, you've got dementia," and then walks out and goes off shift, and they just sort of sit looking at it. Well, who's going to pick that up? Who's going to take that forward? And I think the answer might often be you guys. So there's an issue around diagnosis in cultural and social context, I think. I want to talk a little bit more about that as well. Black, Asian, minority ethnic communities, there's a problem in immigrant communities generally, there's a problem with accessing healthcare, and always has been, and a lot of that is just you're in a comparatively strange country. In a lot of BAME communities now, they're seeing very rapidly rising levels of dementia. Last figures I looked at, between now and 2030, I think, the number of people in this country with dementia is going to roughly double. The number of people from BAME communities with dementia in this country is going to increase by a factor of 7. And the reason for that is just because you've got a whole generation, not just Windrush, but the sort of decade or so after that, of people who arrive in the prime of life who are only now getting really, really old. And so the dementia levels are starting to rise. And on the whole, what we're finding in BAME communities is they're less involved with health services, they're less up to speed with thinking about dementia, at least in the context that we think about dementia, and they're less clear about what services are out there that they could be accessed. There are a few other things as well. Cardiovascular dementia, more common in some South Asian communities by a substantial amount, and some Afro-Caribbean communities as well. That's almost all to do with increased risks of diabetes and cardiac failure in those communities, which are to do with partly with genetics, largely with genetics, and some to a certain extent with lifestyle. There's an interesting one, well I think it's interesting, of Korsakoff's, which is an alcohol-related dementia, and it's unusually high among Sikh men. And the reason for that, I have been told, from within the Sikh community, is because in the days of the British Raj, Hindus didn't want to sort of cooperate at all, you know, the traditional sort of landowners, but the Sikhs, who were the merchant class, and they're not really very attached to the land, they became the officer class in the British Indian Army. And the officer class in the British Indian Army was notorious for knocking back the whiskey by the bottle. So you've got a whole subculture of Sikh men who drink whiskey by the bottle from the age of about 14 onwards. But because the Sikh religion doesn't actually favour alcohol at all, you've got a number of ageing Sikh men with alcohol-related dementias who are just not being reported by their families. It's being talked of as something else. And apparently there's a whole significant subculture there. So there are some odd little sort of things there. So there's a problem with equality of access, and then I think there's a problem on two sides. First is that dementia care providers aren't getting this right. So everybody from, not necessarily you individually, but everybody from social workers up through to psychiatrists are not getting this right. There is this systemic assumption that's been there for a while that particularly actually with South Asian communities, I've said, oh yeah, they look after their own, they're really good at looking after old people. You know, if you're an old person, then the family will sort of cluster around. And of course, a lot of South Asian communities themselves would sort of want to foster that. It's part of their public image too, but it's only intermittently true. So it becomes less true, obviously, where the family disperses all across the country. But it also becomes less true if you are, say, a childless female widow, than if you are a substantial, wealthy male with a large family, with preferably a lot of daughters around and a lot of influence in the community. You're going to get a very different experience of care from your family. There are practical and educational issues. How do you get the message out there? Who is hearing the message? If there is a tradition in a community, and there are a few communities, there are not many, of sort of dementia-like symptoms being a symptom of witchcraft, or dementia-like symptoms just being a symptom of sanctity, which you also get in some communities, then it's not going to be reported, not going to be talked about in the same way. How do you get to the idea, and do you want to get to the idea of dementia as just an organic change in the brain that could affect any of us? And finally, we talk about cultural barriers, about overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis when you're crossing that cultural boundary. How actually do you interpret somebody who can't, for example, a very common test, copy a clock face, the hands on a clock face, if actually they grew up in a community where you just didn't see the hands on the clock face? I mean, there's some evidence now that kids can't tell the time on clock faces, and we might be getting back to that. So what's a culturally appropriate way of finding out? And then within the community and the family itself, and I'm particularly indebted here to my PhD student Nisha Babu, who is looking at the experiences of South Asian people in residential care with dementia. And there's not many of those, but there's getting more of them every year. And she would pick up on all of these things, which I've not really sort of picked up on before. Well, I've talked about alcohol and shame. But what else is moderating the way dementia is talked about and dealt with there? Well, she would talk about status differentials. As I said, a childless widow is not going to get a very good deal necessarily, but much more subtle sort of differentials in status across the community than that. Now, I come from Worcester. We have a Pakistani immigrant community of Pakistani origin. They come from, as far as I can tell, 3 villages in Pakistan, basically. But within the same status differentials within those villages have been mapped into Little Worcester. And so, the people who become the councillors and the mayor are actually the same people who would have become the senior people in the village. So there's all sorts of stuff going on there. There's talk about, I've heard this in relation to Pakistani communities, but I think it's probably much more widely used, widely an issue than that. If your daughter is about to get married and your mother is starting to show signs of dementia, you do not talk about that.
Yeah.
Right, yes.
That is
it's going to affect her prospects. It's going to affect the chance of contracting a good marriage and finding a sort of stable marriage in there. Yeah. So there's all that sort of stuff. And then she picked up on something which I still haven't quite got around my head around, which is that she says in certain South Asian communities, including the one that she's from, when somebody becomes old and frail, the daughter or the daughter-in-law who looks after that person at the end of their life actually gets to manage their money and get to manage the legacy. I'm looking at you because you obviously know what I'm talking about. You've probably got a much better angle.
My granddad has, he's got mixed dementia and Alzheimer's, and I can relate to that. But what I thought was, for my family particularly, it's about denial versus honour. That's what keeps on coming to my head, because my mum and dad look after my granddad, and they've asked for support so many times. I mean, they don't live in this area, but it's like, you look after your own, or you've got family, and that's what they've been told repeatedly. And when I go home over the weekends and I've noticed like a deterioration, and I've said to my mum goes, "Oh, your granddad's spitting on the floor, he's spitting again." And I go, "Mum, that's part of his dementia." Yeah. No, it's not, it's him, he's been awkward.
Yes. But
when, say like we've got a function, they want my granddad to be kind of normal. So it's that honour. Yes. We've got to preserve this, we're a normal kind of family with any little defects.
And also, I suppose the other honour side is sort of it would be dishonourable to say we're going to farm him off to non-relatives to look after. Yes. So the whole set of things going on there. Interesting piece in Turkey actually on that, in relation to Turkey, which I'll come back to you on. So Nisha's picked up on all those things as well. So this just to say, it's not as simple as you walk in somebody's house and think, "Oh, they're behaving a bit funny, let's get them a test and see what happens next." There's a whole question about the timing of the test, the context of the test, the interpretation of the test, and its implications for the people around that person, whether they turn up for it or not.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. So, as Peter said, I'm Jamie Brock, I'm one of the lecturers here in social work. My background is in adult social work, particular focus on the deprivation of liberty. So I'm best interest assessor, so I'm going to talk you through basically what a deprivation of liberty is, and give you just a bit of an idea about what's involved when we're doing these DOLS assessments. You'll hear me refer to DOLS a lot during this. So DOLS is just the process that we follow when we're determining if somebody's been deprived of their liberty, and if so, is that in their best interests. Okay. We've got poor Barbie here, and her relevance to this discussion may become obvious to you. I hope so anyway. So as I said, I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the deprivation of liberty safeguards and focus on how these might be significant for those living with dementia. So you might be relieved to hear that I'm not going to go into lots and lots of detail about the assessments, the processes and all that, because at the moment that's going through change, transition. We're moving away from DOLS to a new system. So instead I want you to think about the deprivation of liberty from a broader perspective and give you about 10 minutes at the end for some questions. So DOLS are part of the Mental Capacity Act 2005, and the safeguards aim to make sure that those 18 years and over in care homes and hospitals are looked after in a way that does not inappropriately restrict their freedom. The safeguards set out a process that hospitals and care homes must follow if they believe it's in a person's best interests to deprive them of their liberty, in order to provide them with a particular care plan. In essence, the DOLS provides a legal process by which a person's human rights to liberty can be breached. Unfortunately for us as assessors, there's no clear legal definition of what constitutes a deprivation of liberty. So that puts us in a bit of a difficult situation from the outset. So before we look at the actual safeguards themselves, let's explore the concept of what a deprivation of liberty might be from a philosophical and perhaps a legal perspective as well, to try and work out what this thing actually is. So what is a deprivation of liberty? It's a term that means different things to different people. There are all kinds of political and moral connotations. It's an idea so fundamental to Western culture, there are even statues honouring it. And perhaps we take the idea for granted so much that we don't always question our understanding of what liberty actually is. The philosopher John Locke argued that all men are naturally in a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of natural law, without asking leave or depending on the will of any other man. So this idea is that people are free to make their own decisions, to come and go as they want, to make their own choices about their life. And in terms of social care, we want service users to make their own decisions as far as possible about what care they want and where they want to receive it. As a society, we take liberty very seriously. It's part of our laws and we place a really high value on it. The philosopher John Stuart Mill, in his book on liberty, argued that all citizens should have these basic freedoms. Not only because it was good for them as individuals, but better for society. And he warned against the interference of the state in the lives of people, as he was concerned that the collective power of elites within society can enforce conformity and constrain behaviour in democratic societies in very much the same way that it happens in dictatorships. And I think these arguments are central to understanding the purpose of DOLS, which aims to protect vulnerable people from unnecessary state intervention. So you've had a bit of a consideration of what liberty might be. But how do we actually assess that? How do we know if somebody's liberty is being restricted or deprived? So the Equalities and Human Rights Commission suggests that imprisonment or being detained are good examples. Hence Barbie. We can see here that she's clearly being deprived of her liberty. She's in prison behind bars, perhaps where she belongs, but somebody's made that decision. But in terms of social care, we have to look more deeply at a situation, to think about the details and every factor that's involved in a person's care plan, to fully understand and appreciate and determine if they are actually being deprived of their liberty. One of the most helpful illustrations is this model here of a continuum of liberty. So we're thinking about the idea of liberty from one extreme, total liberty, freedom to do whatever we want, through to complete deprivation. So I've got another popular culture illustration here. So we've got poor old Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. Some of you will have seen that, others not. But you can see here, this man is clearly being deprived of his liberty. He's in a maximum security prison, in a straitjacket. All his comings and goings are controlled and constrained by the state. So nobody, I would hope, would argue that Hannibal was free. He's definitely been deprived of his liberty. But indeed, the law allows for people who are convicted of offences to be imprisoned so long as they've received a fair trial. Whilst DOLS itself is not a trial, it serves a similar process, as it's a procedure prescribed in law. And just like a trial, the DOLS process involves tests of evidence and the right to appeal. Case law has been critical to developing our understanding of what constitutes a deprivation of liberty. And one of the first cases was the Bournemouth case. Okay. So sometimes that's known as HL versus UK. And this case was pivotal in DOLS coming into force. So HL was a man with autism and he'd been living with his foster carers. He was detained in hospital under the common law of necessity rather than a clear legal process such as being sectioned under the Mental Health Act. Doctors prevented HL's family from visiting him and wouldn't allow him to leave the hospital, nor his carers to take him away. His parents appealed the decision, and eventually, when the case reached the European Court of Human Rights, they agreed with the Court of Appeal and found that HL was being detained, and his right to liberty in Article 5 of the European Convention of Human Rights was applicable in this situation. Further, it held that detention under the common law was incompatible with Article 5 because it was too arbitrary and lacked sufficient safeguards. It's also worthwhile noting that HL was mistreated whilst he was in hospital. His parents had a long battle to get his rights fully respected. The case led to DOLS coming into force, and there have since been many test cases. Most recent was the Cheshire West case, which ruled that human rights are universal. And now, if a given situation would amount to a deprivation of my liberty, it would also be a deprivation of a disabled person's liberty. So it's changed and broadened our understanding of what a deprivation of liberty actually is. So no matter how pleasant the care arrangements might be, how fancy the care home, the deprivation of liberty can still be taking place. And as we know, it's only lawful if a legal process has been followed. So this has presented significant challenges to local authorities, as a number of cases requiring DOLS authorisation and previous assessments have skyrocketed. An important quote here from Lady Hale, who was one of the judges at the Supreme Court when this case was heard. A gilded cage is still a cage. So this idea that people with dementia, unable to consent to the care, living in lovely accommodation, being well cared for, that shouldn't be a distraction. The question is that person deprived of their liberty? Are they free to come and go? Are they able to make their own choices? Can they consent to the care and restrictions that are being placed upon them? And if they can't, it may well be that they are being deprived of their liberty and should be afforded the same safeguards as previously mentioned. In the Cheshire West case, the Supreme Court looked at the meaning of the term deprivation of liberty and summed up by saying what there needed to be in each case was an acid test. So this test asks us to consider, is the person free to leave? And are they subject to complete supervision and control? And within that, again, there's some really broad terms there. So again, we have to look to the case law to see what we mean by continuous supervision and control. What factors and restrictions could, if considered all together, lead us to judge that there was a deprivation of somebody's liberty taking place. They ruled that it didn't matter why certain restrictions were taking place, or even if they were a positive benefit to the person. The facts are the facts, and should be all considered for all people, whether they have a disability or not. If the acid test is met, and the person could not consent to their care and treatment because they lack mental capacity, a best interest assessor needs to look at the case, and any deprivation of liberty must be authorised. And this case brought in a real lowering of the threshold of what we mean by a deprivation of liberty. So that's some of the background. Obviously, because of our time restrictions today, we'll send the slides around. You can actually watch the judgment for this case and the previous one. They're only short videos, really interesting to watch. So now we've got a bit of background. We know what we're using to determine if somebody might be experiencing a deprivation. We've got our case law, looks a bit at philosophy, some of these ideas about restriction. But some of the now if we're thinking about people with dementia, we have to think about sort of their individual situation and the things they might be experiencing. So let's think of the example of somebody with dementia in a nursing home. So some of the things we might consider, if the regime in the home might include certain restrictions. For example, when medication is prescribed, when meals are taken, when people get up in the morning or go to bed. They might not also be able to access all the activities they enjoy within the home. Now, all these things are restrictions, but I think there's a lot of debate whether even added together, all those things would be a deprivation of liberty. We have to look at the whole situation. Other restrictions that might be in place might be locked doors or keypads. And we're thinking about whether people are free to come and go and what might happen if they did try and leave the home. Would they be brought back? These kind of questions need to be addressed as part of the assessment. So we're not just looking at individual factors. It's got to be everything added together and considering whether or not they amount to a deprivation of somebody's liberty. And again, we're looking at that acid test for each particular case. So just to recap, DOLS applies to everybody who lacks capacity to consent to their care arrangements, their accommodation and treatment, and are over 18 years of age. Where you've got a person who's covered by the Mental Capacity Act, but they're aged between 16 and 18, you wouldn't use DOLS for their particular case. That would need to go to the Court of Protection to make a decision about whether they were being deprived of their liberty or not, and if so, if that was in their best interests. So it only deals really with those over 18. It usually applies to hospitals, care homes and nursing homes, but that has been broadened out. But if cases are involving the community, again, the Court of Protection would look at that because it would be a more complex case. And there wouldn't be so much case law around it for best interest assessors like myself to make a decision. Obviously, we've discussed that there's no legal definition of what a deprivation of liberty is. So again, we have to look at the case law and think more broadly about the issue. The DOLS also only applies to care arranged by the state, but that is quite wide-reaching. So it would also be if somebody was self-funding their placement in a care home, they could still be covered by DOLS. That phrase, they use the phrase in the guidance, imputable to the state. Quite confusing, but actually it doesn't mean that the state has to pay for it. It could be they're just involved in arranging that care or for any other reason. So, what are the safeguards? So we've talked in a lot of detail about the tests and what goes on, but what actual protections are afforded to people once you've established that they might be deprived of their liberty? What does this process give them, which they didn't have before? Okay, so we mentioned it applies only to adults over 18 years old, obviously those who lack capacity. This is quite crucial, that it is only specific to decisions around care, accommodation and treatment. Sometimes in my practice I've heard people discuss DOLS as if it's sort of a means to resolve conflict within families, access issues, all sorts of things, finances, and that's not right. Anything of that nature, again, you try to resolve that with families, but if you can't, you go to the Court of Protection. You can't use DOLS to say that such and such family member can't visit. So one of the main safeguard is that it's no longer an arbitrary process. It isn't just a doctor saying you need to stay in hospital, you can't make your own decisions and you'll stay here as long as I say so. It's now a case that it's an administrative process that has to be followed every single case. So it's the same treatment for everybody. 6 assessments are carried out for every single person to ensure that that process is fair and that everything relevant is covered. I won't go into the detail of that because in the new arrangements things might change. But again, the principle will remain that everybody has the same safeguards and it's uniform across the country. So acid test is applied in each and every case. So everybody that's had an assessment will have had that acid test applied to their situation. The deprivation of somebody's liberty must be in their best interest and to prevent harm. So underpinning that would be a robust risk assessment, outlining what restrictions are in place and justifying why they're there. So this is a massive interference with people's fundamental rights. We're removing their right to liberty, and we professionally and legally have to account for that and say why we're doing that and why, if those restrictions were removed, be specific about what actual harm might occur. And of course, with any decision made on behalf of somebody who lacks capacity, think about the Mental Capacity Act, any decisions made about them must be the least restrictive option. So we're still trying to minimise the level of restriction in place, even though we're appreciating, if we're saying that a deprivation of liberty should be authorised, there are going to be lots of restrictions. We must make sure it's still at the bare minimum to keep them safe. Okay, so just a couple more protections. The assessments are undertaken by a best interest assessor, so that would be a social worker, a nurse, or an occupational therapist. I think a couple of other allied health professionals can undertake that role as well. Usually 2 years qualified as a minimum, experienced person, somebody equipped with some specialised training to fulfil this particular role. But obviously they don't do that in isolation. They work with a mental health assessor, usually a Section 12 doctor, usually the kind of doctor that would be involved in sectioning people, a real expert in mental health. We work with the best interest assessor to make sure you've got a rounded perspective on things. And of course you talk to family members, health professionals, anybody, any interested person, to try and get a good picture of that person, what their circumstances are. Another real benefit of the system, as opposed to prior to DOLS, now we have to make sure that everybody's got an advocate. So within this, independent mental capacity advocate, we've got the acronym there, IMCA. If you'll mention an IMCA to you, that would be where they would fit into this process. Or just a representative, which may be a family member, it might not. Most crucially, it needs to be somebody who would challenge any practice or any care plans that were too restrictive or not restrictive enough for that person. So it needs to be somebody quite clued up, somebody confident, somebody who will challenge on behalf of that person. Crucially, the advocate or representative, whoever's taking on that challenging role, has a right to request a review at any time. So if things are changing, perhaps the person's deteriorating or the behaviour is getting more risky, they can ask for a review. Or hopefully, if they don't need as much restriction, they're shouting up and say, actually, perhaps we don't need 2 members of staff with this person at any one time. Perhaps it can go down to 1. Let's try that out. So it's about constantly, I pressed the wrong button. There we go. Challenging and thinking about the ways to reduce restrictions on people. As we said, taking away somebody's liberty is a massive thing. So we want to make sure we're doing that carefully and proportionately. Further safeguard, there's always an annual review. So in this final point here, DOLS authorisations only last for 12 months at present, although that will be changing. Then that expires, so that deprivation of liberty would no longer be authorised if that lapsed. Now, local authorities are struggling to achieve that 12-month review, but that, the intention of the system was always that it was never a permanent thing. There's always checks and balances and reviews to make sure everything is above board. Right to appeal to court, obviously the representative would be trying, if there was any problems, would try and resolve those with the care home, or the social workers or whomever. But within this process, under Section 21A of the Mental Capacity Act, was that right to challenge and take things to court if need be, if you don't feel that deprivation of liberty is warranted, and some way in cases have been to court and things. That happens quite regularly. It's a bit of an industry amongst some solicitors in making sure that happens. For me, DOLS is about making sure that human rights are respected and that we make sure that everybody has fair access to a robust system that makes sure that any restrictions and deprivations of people's liberty are, in accordance with the law, and they have access to fairness and justice, which is what social work is all about, isn't it? So, for any social workers that are interested in this role, I would encourage you to explore it a bit further, because it is really worthwhile. Particularly sometimes when you get involved in sort of your day-to-day casework, you get bogged down the form filling and stuff, and there are lots of paperwork with DOLS, but they can be quite meaty cases and quite challenging around your knowledge, your skills and values. So I would encourage people to look into it. Just another couple of comments before we finish. DOLS are only used in England and Wales. Other areas will have different arrangements. I presume everybody's local, but if you're working around the country, it's different systems in different areas. And DOLS will be replaced by a new but quite similar system next year, hopefully, if it's not delayed.